I told the first and second services about an incident that occurred in the lives of my wife and I some considerable time ago, many, many years ago, when we were first married, in the dim, dark ages beyond recall. We had a friend who was a retired engineer. He had worked for one of the big automobile companies, I think it was General Motors, and he had retired to a little house. He called it his bungalow on the edge of the ocean. It was a beautiful spot. The waves rolled up virtually to the deck. And of course, the sunsets were magnificent. And one day he asked us if we would like to be his guests at dinner. And we said, yes, that would be fine. We'd come along, which we dutifully did. A bottle of cheap wine tucked under our arm. Sorry about that, but, you know, we were young and trying to make our way in the world. And he was no connoisseur anyway. I knew that. And he cooked his own dinners. I knew that too. So we had a pleasant dinner. In his company, we watched the sun sink. But while we were there talking to one another, having a good time, I was aware, and so was my wife, of a constant noise. A very intrusive noise, a roaring sound. And I assumed at first that it was a generator providing the electricity to the house, this little cottage. But I thought when I came down the road that I had seen wires carrying electricity to the house, so that couldn't have been it. Well, we had our dinner together, we had a good time, and then I asked him towards the end of our evening together, I said, Roger, it's been a great evening. We've seen the sunset, this beautiful, tranquil spot that you have. It's so quiet, so beautiful here. But I said, the noise. He said, let me show you what the noise is. So we got up from the stoop there and walked across a little bit of sand to a building that he had constructed, I think himself. And it was from this point that the noise was emanating. And he opened the door, and the noise became almost deafening. And there was a screen, I remember, as we opened the door, there was a screen with a little notch that was cut out that we could see through. And behind this, there was an automobile engine on a bench that was running flat out. It was, and I kid you not, it was red hot. The block was glowing. Now, people will say this is an exaggeration. I assure you that if you run an automobile engine flat out for long enough, it will get very, very, very hot. And this one was visibly glowing. And he said, well, I'm testing engines for whatever division of General Motors it might have been, I can't remember. And he said, sooner or later this engine will blow. It will self-destruct. It will just crack and all hell will break loose. This is why we're behind this screen. That's what he was doing in his retirement, testing engines to their breaking point. Having seen this with my own eyes, I was struck to an extraordinary degree, and I have carried that visual metaphor, really, with me all my life, that if you push something hard enough, if you drive it hard enough, if you press it to its limits, guess what? It will explode. It will self-destruct. Now, I don't like to draw analogies between machinery and the human being, because very often they're false. The mechanistic analogy, it's called. But in this instance, I think that comparison, that analogy, is justified. if we push ourselves hard enough, too hard in fact, self-destruction in some form or another, dependency, physical breakdown, physical illness, is likely to occur. Nature didn't design us to run at full throttle until we explode. Now, Jesus knew this very well. And he told us in Mark these words: "The Sabbath was made for the sake of man, and not man for the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made for the sake of man, and not man for the Sabbath." That's one sentence. Very often when you look at Jesus' words, you look for these little nuggets of gold that are concealed in lengthier discourse. And this teaching is very, very important. For in Jesus' day, the Sabbath had become an opportunity for ritual observances by his fellow Jews. It was not a time of rest and reflection. Even God, Jehovah God, we read in the book of Genesis, took a day off after he'd created the universe. But gradually, this notion of rest as a balance to work and involvement in life, gradually this notion had been diminished, watered down. And so it was a time of ritual observance. Jesus was the great iconoclast, iconoclastes in Greek, the breaker of images, but also the breaker down of prejudices and fixed ideas. He said, no, remember, the Sabbath is a time of rest and recreation, reflection that we need to experience if we are to encounter life successfully. We can't go on like that revving engine, pushing all the time. And modern life so often demands this of us. It seems that we have no time for those precious moments of reflection. I won't say recreation. Maybe some of you, I'm preaching to the converted, maybe some of you spend the afternoon on a surfboard out on Waikiki. I don't know. Be careful. That's all I can say. Great time to reflect and perhaps to relax. But many of us are driven constantly by our obligations, by our commitments, by our fears, by our desires to control other people. It's so much easier to control the lives of other people, to influence the lives of other people. Wouldn't you agree? I have found it so. I have the example before me of my beloved mother and father. My dad was, like me, a Sagittarian. Do you know what Sagittarians are like? Do you believe in astrology? I don't think I do, but my profile as a Sagittarian fits the profile of the perfect Sagittarian. Impatient, driving, always feeling that his or her presence is necessary and required for the successful outcome of any enterprise. Arrogant, surely. I have been here since the end of March, I think, as far as I can remember. I have been in this building, on this campus, every day since then, because I think the place is going to go to hell in a cocked hat if I'm not sitting in my desk chair. We have a wonderful staff, a fantastic support team. They do so much. Why am I sitting there waiting for some issue to occur at which, of course, my great mediating presence is required? I'm waiting for that phone call, yes, well, there we are. That's my nature. I'm a driver. My wife, bless her dear beloved heart, she who must be obeyed, has set for me, before I leave for Europe next month, and a great deal of commitment and obligation, I can assure you, she has set for me an agenda during which I am obliged to relax. She says this is my required Sabbath. She's a wise woman, and so, of course, naturally, I defer to her demands. She, incidentally, is not a Sagittarian. I saw this in my mother and father. My dad was, like me, a Sagittarian, and I'm not proclaiming the value or the veracity of these beliefs, but he sort of fitted that profile. He was a pusher, always pushing. He worked for Radio Corporation of America, and he was convinced that there was no job that didn't require his immediate presence to make sure it was completed successfully. Apparently RCA agreed with him, but they didn't pay him any more because he was present 24 hours a day. He drove himself into the ground, literally by his constant presence, by his refusal to take any time away at all, emotionally, spiritually, physically. He killed himself, literally. My mother was a far more sagacious woman. What a lovely word. She was a far more sagacious woman. Every afternoon, and we ran a hotel. When my dad retired from RCA, he bought a hotel under the rather deluded notion that he could sit back and let it run itself. But, of course, this would not happen with my dad's temperament. He was there every day, present, until 1 a.m, scrubbing the floors of the kitchen to make sure cockroaches didn't appear. I never saw a cockroach, but he was afraid that they might appear, which to him would have been anathema, so he was there on the floor scrubbing anyway. My dear mother, who actually ran the place when we get down to it, she insisted every afternoon at 3 o'clock, she went to her room and she took her rest, as we euphemistically called it. It was her time of communion. It was her Sabbath, her daily Sabbath. Mr. Fillmore, the co-founder of our movement, said, the Sabbath occurs every time we remove, and I'm paraphrasing him, when we remove ourselves from life's cares and place ourselves in that wonderful spiritual consciousness and center that each one of us has. It's in this way that we renew ourselves, that we find the strength and courage and confidence to go forward into another encounter with life. We don't do this all the time like mindless jackhammers. We take time. We take the Sabbath. You can take a Sabbath in a moment, in an hour, which she did every afternoon, religiously, one might say spiritually. She took an hour from 3 to 4. Nobody ever dared to disturb her. My mother was a mild-mannered woman, but if you disturbed her during that hour, you were likely to experience irritation. She took that hour and she went, as she put it herself, she went away. That was her time of communion, her time of renewal. And she took it religiously every day. Consequently, she was a healthier woman, healthier individual than my beloved father, who couldn't learn that lesson. Both of them were entirely committed to their obligations, completely committed to what they did. But one had the sense to spend that time, that daily Sabbath, in communion and reflection. The other, bless his dear beloved heart, now he's gone, he didn't. Consequently, he endured a life of discomfort which she did not experience. Nature demands of us. The old folks, the ancient peoples, knew this. Nature demands that we understand the spectrum of work and rest. Every creature that exerts itself needs its time of rest. We, as self-reflecting human beings, take that time to consider our lives and circumstances. It's a wonderful opportunity to let God work in our lives and affairs. We are so preoccupied with the notion that only we alone can control our lives and affairs that we've long ago left God and Spirit out of the equation. But when we pull ourselves back for an hour, for a day, for a week even, and let God work in our lives and affairs, it's astounding what may occur. When we can forget that we ourselves believe we are the only ones who can control everything. And this notion of control is comparatively recent, a fairly recent development in the course of the human movement towards self-understanding. 300 years ago, it was thought that this earth was the center of the universe. Big mistake, but understandable. The only problem was that 300 years ago, for the earth as the center of the universe, substituted was the human ego. We became anthropocentric. See how I'm wedded to these archaic Greek notions. Anthro meaning man, pocentric. And so we suddenly felt that the great weight of running the universe devolved on ourselves. Oh, yes, we're running the whole... Look what a hell of a mess we've made. I mean, I really don't want to go there today, but... or any other time for that matter, but I don't think we've done a hugely successful job of running either the universe or our private lives, because we have forgotten the balance that is necessary in our existence. Yes, of course, commitment, of course, work, of course, obligation. That's how society survives. We're not fools. We know this. But there are times when we have to pull back, step aside, allow ourselves an opportunity for renewal. And as in my mother's case, that can happen daily with a meditation. It can happen when we take a whole week off and just do nothing except be rather silly. Maybe jump in the water and get out of the water, and jump in the water and get out of the water, and have something to eat and jump in the water. I wouldn't do that right after having something to eat, but having something to eat, jump in the water. I mean, we're not called upon to be driven all the time by our own ego-centered desires and accumulated commitments. There must be this time to acknowledge the presence of Spirit within us. And when we do that, very often we see how Spirit does work in our lives. A perspective is established. We see that we're not obliged to run life and everybody else's life as well. It's better sometimes to just let go and let God. I remember my grandmother, bless her beloved soul, was able to do that. Nobody ran other people's lives more effectively than my grandmother. My God, she was a manager. She was born in 1856 and she died in 1954, excuse me. And I knew her very well. She was 98 when she died. She was a superb manager. She ran the entire family. Well, they let her because they were terrified of her. But there were times when she would let down and she'd say, "Go on, do it yourselves. I know you'll screw it up, but do it yourselves. That's all right." That was her nature. But that going aside, however it was motivated and whatever impelled her, did cause her to live to be 98 years of age. And she just got tired of going on. She said, "I'm tired now. I want to go to sleep. Go away and leave me alone." I remember her saying those words very well. In her 98th year, she gathered the family around her. She said, "I've run things all my life. I've taken time off to look after myself all my life. And now I'm tired. And I want to go home, leave me alone." And we did, and within 48 hours she was dead. And the doctor hadn't the faintest idea what to put on the death certificate. He was appalled. He said, "We've got to have something." Well, they put down myocardial infarction because they can't think of anything else to put down. But she was ready. She was finished. She'd done. This was her final removal. She was letting go. She wasn't afraid. She was letting go. She'd done enough. But she had always lived, I remember it said, a balanced life. A balanced life. Tremendous commitment in an era which demanded it, perhaps more than our current era does. An era that demanded that women especially be the support of large families. She had lived that life, but she had never failed to give herself the time that she needed to refresh. She knew very well that although she was thought of as the governor of the entire family, she wasn't really running things. She gave people latitude to make their own decisions. Of course, she said afterwards, when things went wrong, what did you expect? But that was quite beside the point. That was something we learned and grew to expect. But she was a balanced woman. She lived perhaps more within the confines of nature than did a later generation. Jesus taught us that the Sabbath is vitally important, because it's a time of withdrawal, contemplation, and renewal. Nature demands this of any organism that expects to survive effectively and successfully. Yes, of course, we may spend the majority of our time involved with our commitments, our obligations. That's life. But we must never forget there is a time to stand back. We must be wise enough to stand back and to give Spirit an opportunity to renew not only ourselves, but to work within the context of the experience that we're enjoying, so that we may see the activity of Spirit in everything that our world contains. I can tell you now, had I not seen that engine running on that block, running to self-destruction, I can tell you confidently now, had I not learned the lesson contained in that vision, I would not be speaking to you now, because I'd have been too much of a damn fool to realize what it was telling me. I did realize, and I have struggled to live my life accordingly. And now I'm being told to sit down and shut up.